Okay, good. Right, let's get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to OT Security Connect. We're following up last month's session with a session discussing incident response and recovery. For everyone that was here last time, thanks for coming back. Our community is expanding, and we're here to welcome everybody new to the community and everyone that's coming back. So, thanks for joining. I'm Elliot Davies. I'm the founder of OT Security Connect and cybersecurity recruitment company QuantaHire. Today's webinar is incident response and recovery and how it's a fundamental pillar of your cybersecurity posture within OT. Our expert panel is going to delve into the unique challenges within OT, covering both pre and post incident scenarios, and just a bit about the community. The objective is to build an engaged, supportive community. We're here to focus on helping each other strengthen OT security practices. And so please feel free to ask questions throughout. The Q&A section is open, and we'll cover that as we go. It's not a sort of wait till the end type thing. It's just to engage as we go, and feel free to fire questions throughout. So to get us started, I'm going to hand over to our panelists for some introductions. Please share your name, your current role, a quick highlight of your expertise. And let's start with Michael, followed by Rob, Max, and Sam.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, and maybe good evening to everyone who's attending. My name is Michael Wu. I'm Managing Director of Access Management Solutions Consulting here in the UK. And we specialise in privileged access management, identity access management in IT and OT environments. And on to the next person, Rob. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Rob Hayes, Managing Director at SIA Partners, heading up UK and Ireland cybersecurity consulting. Got a background of about, it's now, as of the week, 28 years in OT cyber, 10 of which was hands-on control and system engineering, followed by 18 years in consulting, working on IT security, OT security, and major incidents in the IT and OT space. Thank you.
Okay, next, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. My name is Max Higginson. I work at Domino's UK and Ireland. My role is the supply chain manager, which looks after ICS OT environments.
And Sam Taylor. I currently work for Enfinium as a contractor, mainly looking at their kind of virtual CISO role. So trying to advise myself on how to implement several different controls, both in the IT and OT environments, as well as doing some GDPR on the side.
Right, thanks everyone. Good to get started. And yeah, let's begin with the why. So why is incident response a critical pillar of cybersecurity within OT? Let's get into sort of baselining why we do it and why it's so key, and go from there.
Sure, I'll kick that off. For me, it's a really foundational thing in OT cyber. Regardless of your criticality of your asset is still required, and therefore every asset must be able to respond and recover to a cyber incident. You may not spend the inordinate amount on protection of it, but pretty much you need to be able to respond and recover it. How much you spend depends on how quickly you want to recover that asset, but all assets need that if you still require that asset.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think it just builds in resiliency within an organization. I mean, it's so integral to be able to recover in a fashion, and making sure that you do so based on the criticality of those systems. Having the criticality at kind of the start and understanding your process and where you would ultimately want to rebuild and how quickly is just so important. And getting that kind of muscle memory within your exec team is vital.
Good. So obviously we've got incident response and recovery that people, well, I'm sure everyone will be familiar with it in IT environments, but what's unique about it within OT, and kind of, what are the differences there?
Well, for me, it goes back to, again, another fundamental challenge with OT. It's about understanding the operating environment. These environments are, managing health, safety, environmental risks, as well as producing what they're producing, and some of those services and products are 24/7. So the requirement to get them back up and running is higher. but also the systems that you're working with. You can't just tear down stuff and rebuild it. Do you have to just stop the process? Do you have the vendor support? All of those things. It's a really tricky environment in which to do this activity. For instance, forensics. Who's got the possibility to stop a whole system, not recover it quick, but actually dive into forensics? Oh, why did this happen? Actually, these organizations don't. They need to get it up and running as fast as possible.
And what about, so, I mean, we've got Max and Sam, I think, on the call, who probably are operating in within two very different business models as leaders for security and within end users. Sam, I think renewable energy is probably the best way to categorize Enfinium, isn't it?
It's waste to power is best way to categorize it, although they are now also looking at carbon capture at the end of that. So they take non-recyclable waste, they burn it in a more environmentally friendly way than just putting it in a field. And then they turn that into power. But then they also want to do the carbon capture at the end of it, which is really kind of fantastic within the organization.
And does the business itself present its own unique models? Because I think OT is such a broad spectrum of different industries that everybody can face very unique challenges within their own industry.
Yeah, one of the biggest things is safety. Like I think Rob touched on it. The main thing with any kind of incident is you want to ensure that the safety of the individuals on site and the surrounding areas are of paramount importance. If any of that is at any point in danger, that's what you've got to focus on. The next thing is, what is the environment? What is the thing that is actually causing the issue? Now, if that's kind of, our weigh bridge, so that's where the trucks get weighed, and the rubbish is then we get paid for that. That is less important than if it's the boiler, because the boiler has got a load of different safety concerns, or the turbine. So all of those just need to be taken into account. And it's working with the kind of site and the engineers to go through some of their kind of hazard analysis to understand where is that biggest risk, and where do we need to kind of focus our time and energy when an incident occurs.
Fine. What about for you, Matt?
I think that's key, isn't it? It's what does your business do, and how do you apply it to your business? Because each business has a different set of processes, or their manufacturing or power generation, whatever it may be. So I think actually the OT environment, you've actually got to understand the process of what you're trying to do. Obviously, we've mentioned safety being obviously the key in everything we do, but fundamentally it is understanding how the engineering, the actual business produces whatever goods they do. And typically a lot of OT environments will have legacy equipment. They'll have third parties that they rely on. So when we're looking at incident response, it's coming at it from an approach of not just you, the company, it's you and all your suppliers that you're dependent on, and all your supply chain. To have that, I guess, drawn together approach between not just you and everyone else, it is quite critical to have a clean incident response process.
Good stuff. Okay, so I think what we'll start to cover now is pre-incident considerations and scenarios. So, how do we plan? How do we build something that protects before things happen and prevents that? So, what are the key elements of an incident response plan within OT?
So just touching on what Max and Sam said, it's about getting down what that key business process is, what that key manufacturing process is, and then assigning the criticality to the different systems. And that, for me, I don't speak to the technology people or the security people until I've actually spoken to the people who run the operations. And that does a number of things. It lets the operations people know that that's the thing I'm focused on, keeping them operational. This is not this is a business risk thing we're trying to manage, not a cyber risk. Then starting to map out the technology that underpins all of that business process, the controls, and then starting to understand, okay, what's their current response and recovery capability? Then where do they need to get to in terms of getting aligned with the business resilience requirements? So I've got a methodology which I've done over time, but the important thing for me is that this is one of those few opportunities you actually get to get all the stakeholders together. So it can be kind of very much a culture changing activity. And it's something I do very early on in a program, because, you know, risk assessment's great, takes time and money, but doesn't really change the risk. And inventory is great, but doesn't really change the risk much. But this activity brings people together. It gives you a clear communicable outcome to the board. I can recover my sites in this time. We're now achieving to, you know, we're aiming to get to recover them in this time. So I think it's a real strong pillar at the beginning of an OT program.
I think just to add to that as well, you mentioned obviously having changing. It doesn't actually necessarily change the risk. Obviously, I think the assumption is when you're looking at incident response, you know what your assets are. You know that you have some level of network visibility, because them two obviously quite key to then provide that extra level on top to actually, like you say, change the risk. So I think, yeah, having then them two in place, then you can look at the incident response plan, communication with roles and responsibilities, like you say, getting everyone together. Because with OT, generally you need a lot more people than an IT. It's quite significant, especially when you're operating multiple sites across different countries in time regions. It's all these sort of things as well that are often forgotten about, the actual logistics of putting everyone together as well.
And working out what can go wrong. So what is it that we're trying to defend against? And therefore, what does an incident look like within all of those elements? And then who is ultimately going to be able to do that? Is that insider threat, hacktivists, et cetera, and that will all be different for different industries, et cetera. But it's making sure that you've got that within your plan.
I think you raise an important point there. If you look at the documented target attacks on OT, they're not as big as people think. It's not as big a list. Some of it is leakage in from the IT space, and some of it, and most of it, is about people having to shut down operations because their IT environment has been impacted. So I think having those things in the front of mind when you're creating the plan, what is it I'm preparing for? Target attack, operational shutdown because of something going on in the IT space, and they're different plans, but they're both required.
What I'm also seeing a lot in the industry is IT pushing access management controls into the OT side. And yes, as you just mentioned there, Rob, a lot of things that are affecting IT then have that knock-on effect of affecting OT. I mean, when it comes to best practice, it's best to air gap your access controls away from IT, so you never get that overflow if there is an issue, and to actually be able to identify people when they're accessing, what they're accessing, how they're accessing these control systems is absolutely critical from a forensic and from an auditing perspective. But over and above that, only the right people should have the right access to the right systems from a health and safety perspective, which is massively critical.
Yeah, one area that was concerning when I went to a conference recently was that more and more, so the difficulty with OT has always been most of the sites are bespoke. Each one of your sites will be built kind of very much in a bespoke way, which makes it harder for people to get into them. The thing that the OEMs are now doing is building things that are more kind of standardized. So the more standardized you get a system, the easier it is then to get in. So if you now look at water treatment plants compared to energy facilities, they're starting to become more of that standardized environment, which is the same as the IT environment. And it's always been easier to get into IT because it's connected to the dirty internet. But yeah, that was one thing that I took away from a very good conference. So we can only see it increase.
Oh, yeah, this seems to be the trend. So
I think standardization helps you apply controls better, but I think with every innovation in technology, there's always another avenue there for the malign or to go at.
An interesting use case I came across recently was remote access into OT production systems, particularly in the water industry. For example, if there's a water pump that's serving a reservoir that's 100 miles away, and an engineer to go out to this remote location will take a full day, if not 2 days, to get out there and back to get a pump working, for example. And it was to start implementing remote access. Now, remote access is a great thing. Where there's the technology to enable it, such as wireless 3G, 4G, 5G to enable that, is fantastic. You're saving engineer time. There's also the green aspect that you're not burning hydrocarbons to get there and get back as well, and they can do it in the comfort of their own home. So yeah, these technology enablers are great. It simplifies access, and when you start simplifying access and leveraging the technology, you're introducing risk. That's why it's very, very important to have these controls put in place, have that standardization, enforcing controls frameworks throughout to help mitigate that risk. Risk will always be there. Yeah, that's one thing we're just going to have to.
But that's the conversation that I'm having with some of the suppliers in the past, where they would say to me, "We've got a connection going out, so this isn't remote access in. This is a connection going out, and all we do is we take data." And it's only when you really start to scratch the surface and you ask them, "Can you also get back in?" They go, "Yeah, we don't use it, but we can." and it's those types of things that you're just trying to identify, and it's getting that visibility across your estate and understanding all of that to then start to protect it and then put in place the kind of incident response plans for it.
But I have seen zero. Sorry, I was going to say, is it the words then? I've seen remote access be really useful in recovering an organisation, given that your vendors are spread all over the world. If you can get into an instant a good secure remote access solution, I think the Zscaler would be one of them. You can start to rebuild a lot quicker. Get your vendors in there, and actually, I think that's where I see zero trust being adopted is post incident, not by design, but using those tools after an incident to enable, and then keeping them in there as it's providing that secure identified services as we talk about.
And on that as well, it actually funnels all your activity, remote activity, through one system, so you can actually put a lot more monitoring in. So you can cut out, if you basically say you're going to use that one system, block everything else, it forces everyone to go through a single front door, where you can obviously put intense security monitoring on, where if you had it mixed across the estate, it's easy for someone to potentially get in, because you're not monitoring as thoroughly as possible.
I think we might have identified the topic for the next webinar, which might be.
But that also directly ties into your recovery time objective and recovery point objective, which are absolutely critical when it comes to bringing back your infrastructure, standing up and getting it production ready again. Is how quickly you can provision access to your vendors, to your third parties, to help bring it all back up. So very much when we're looking at DORA, we're looking at business resilience, we're looking at these metrics, or RTO, RPO, for example, as how the underlying technology has a direct implication on that, and how it supports attaining those RPOs and RTO metrics as defined by the business.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Rob.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to bring us back into the incident response theme and save the juicy remote access for the next session. But if we were to look at the typical life cycle for incident response in OT, can we walk through at a high level kind of what that looks like, just for just to get back onto that theme?
In terms of pre-incident or post-incident?
Pre-incident.
Well, I talked earlier about the mapping the processes, mapping the technology, mapping the controls, setting out the target recovery, developing the plan. But then you've got to go into that cycle of test, improve, test, improve, test, improve. And I think it's reasonably simple in that sense. Where the complication lies is in that testing, in that development. You have a host of internal stakeholders and third parties that you need to involve, and that's really the complication. It's not a complex cycle, but how do you bring these people into it to have an effective plan?
And when you're trying to roll that out, and you've got that buy-in from the stakeholders and you're pushing the plan out, what key resources do you need? what tools or training? How would you kind of build a function around that?
To build a incident response recovery framework for OT is not complex. I think it can be joint owned by OT and IT personnel, but it's not complex. And I think it's one of those activities that you can use the team that's just implemented it to then bootstrap the other teams and do a phased rollout. So I think you can get your own organization if you do it properly and it's all well documented, good framework, and you've got the buy-in. You can use your existing teams to then help deploy that across the other lower priority assets. It's around people and process primarily, right? Around detection, there's something in there, but primarily people and process. And manufacturing sites are pretty good at managing people and process.
Because as well with the incident response to the IT piece, I think it's something like 70% of OT attacks come from an IT environment or is transferred over in some form or another. So I think while we are talking OT IR, it is quite critical to not have it as a siloed function or a siloed document or siloed process. Yep. It does have to work across. Yes, you've got more teams involved and maybe a bigger scope, but there has to be communication and clear processes how the OT IR links to the IT IR. And also you've got to think as well for incident management. So if there's a fire, if there's something like that, whilst that's not strictly a technological piece, but it could have a real world effect if you had a fire in the factory, for example. So you've got to link, I guess, these three pieces, the IT IR, OT IR, and I guess a general incident management process together.
Two points on that. I think sometimes we forget that people who manage industrial processes manage risk on a daily basis and actually very good at it. What they don't know is how to manage cybersecurity risk. So when you're doing this with them, try and help them by aligning to their current existing risk management processes. I think the other one that you pointed out is don't do it in a silo. So when somebody says, can you create a target operating model for OT? I said, well, what I will do, we'll map out your technology stack that's really, that your manufacturing or industrial process rely on. And then all of a sudden you find there's a big chunk of ERP system on the other side, which is super critical to it. And so therefore I then come up with the manufacturing technology operating model or manufacturing technology cyber operating model, because you've got to go across that value chain, the things that are really important to manufacturing. The amount of instances where I've seen that a OT environment has not been impacted, however, ERP has, and therefore they can't feed in the information of what they need to produce, but even if they could produce it manually, they can't do the logistics, the printing at the end, and literally simple printing that's sat on your IT domain, that's, and the ERP stuff stops you distributing. And if that's in time critical products, and food being one of them, that might resonate. I was talking to a company that mass produced frozen food, and they said, "Oh, it's all right, we'll send it out to this warehouse." And they realised actually we can't send it out to these separate warehouses because we're just going to lose track of it and it'll all go off and rot. So I think it's really important when you're doing this planning is understanding what sits in front of the OT that still keeps your production operational.
Yeah, and then don't forget about the slight magnitude of business change. Trying to get an organization, once you've written that plan and you've kind of shared it with a couple of people, in actual fact, you need everybody to buy into it and to understand it and to really know what their role within it is. So it's all kind of, well, like I've seen so many organizations where they take their incident response plan, put it on the shelf, and that's it. Kind of practice it with a set number of people, but in actual fact, you need everybody to start to kind of live and breathe it, because your incident response plan is also, like Max said, it could be a fire, it could be something else. If everybody knows what their role within it is, it's so much easier to kind of, when it does happen, to actually do it properly.
Yeah, it's really important. And when I go through the planning exercise, it's one of the first times that somebody who's sat behind the scenes from the manufacturing process but operating a critical system starts to realize, actually, God, what I do is really important to what this business is, the business outcomes of this organization. And the cultural shift I've seen by getting the people into the room and aligning to them to the business process that they're trying to recover or protect has been really quite powerful.
I think the ability as well to actually having a document's very good. it's great. It's a good start, but I think you actually put that into test. The realities of real world scenarios might not match up to your document, and having that ability to actually go and then test, I guess, a tabletop exercise from an engineering perspective, from a cyber perspective, from the board's perspective, the communications out to the world, whatever it may be, having all these different lenses practiced in the real world to your specific business will be one of the best things you do, because you'll find every problem you've got, and you want to do that ahead of an incident, not during one.
Testing these recovery procedures, can that be challenging in itself?
Yes.
Yeah, don't break production.
Yeah.
I mean, availability is, when we're talking OT, availability is key, isn't it? At the end of the day, where in an IT world, it's confidentiality sort of piece. So it depends on the organisation. I've got friends that work in nuclear power, and sort of the idea of downtime, it look of horror on their face. So it depends on the organisation. The actual to test it, challenges will be subjective to what part of, or what business or industry you are in.
I've got to be honest, I don't think I've ever seen a physical real life test on a full environment.
You could do it.
Yeah,
you could do it. So you could do a digital twin. I think the only thing then to bear in mind is make sure you keep that digital twin very, very safe, because that's basically giving the keys to the castle, and then hopefully you're protecting them. But it's doable, but it has to be done carefully. Like everything, like putting OT controls in has to be done carefully, because again, there's a health and safety element, but also don't affect that availability target.
Yeah, if you want to lose traction with an OT cyber program, impact a site, and even though these sites operate autonomously, all sites will find out that this cybersecurity program for OT has been shutting us down, and it's very bad press.
Yeah, I didn't sleep for all of June.
Was that as a direct consequence of something going wrong?
Implementing controls. So as a conscientious person, and also as a person that deals with people within the engineering side of things, you don't want to do exactly what Rob just said. You don't want to impact them. You want it to be as smooth as possible. You want to give them an overview at the start as to what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. It's the same as incident response planning. You need to do all of that so that they get true buy-in and understanding as to what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're going to do it. You then follow the management of change process. But in the back of your mind, I'm still the person that will wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, did we cover everything that I should have? And you have, but it's always, it's a bigger concern than if you're doing an IT implementation.
Do you have any
for that? You're just going to annoy some people. But this is more significant, I would say.
And how would you do it and still sleep? Is there any tips for people?
Do it more often. I think that every site is different. So I've not seen a similar site where we've had the same problem. So every time we've learned from a problem, or I've learned from a problem, or a supplier's learned from a problem, we've moved forward. But every single site, there's always something new, always something weird and wonderful. I met a wonderful guy in engineering once who said to me, do you know what, Sam? Don't need to worry about USB drives anymore. I put super glue in all of them. And I went, do you remember WannaCry when we had to plug USB drives in? And he went, okay, I'll get my soldering iron out this weekend and I'll undo it all. So they're learning from every single implementation, but you'll never be able to know everything about the site. This is the double-edged sword of trying to put some monitoring in place. Is you want the monitoring to tell you what's in there, but you don't know what's in there until you put the monitoring in. And therefore you have to kind of be able to be relatively agile in that phase. But you'd never want to hit an availability target, because the engineers will just hate you forever.
I think that one thing that you can try and do is get them to take as much ownership of that as possible. Because at the end of the day, it will be them leading and running it and being accountable for that response and recovery. Yes, they will get support from IT, they will get support from third parties, but it will be them running it in the long term. So I think as much ownership you can put on them as possible. And again, therefore, it's key to align it with their current risk management practices and processes.
And that itself, if we look at, say, the challenges of testing it, getting people's time and getting the amount of people you need, I mean, that's a challenge within itself.
Going back to Rob's point about getting accountability from the sites, and then coordinating IT alongside that, can that be challenging in itself in getting sites cooperating and working with trust with the IT teams, particularly if the IT teams maybe have different priorities as they usually do? Is that an area that requires a lot of work, a lot of coordination, and I guess diplomacy, or how would you approach that?
I think what you've got to do, you've got to choose your pilot sites very well.
Yeah.
You need to choose a team that you can trust, a team that trusts you, and you build that level of trust, because then what happens is the other sites hear the good news that what you're trying to achieve, and that information propagates. So you've got to pick your pilot sites well, where you're going to test this out. So one that has a good relationship with the engineering teams, one with a good relationship with the IT teams. I was going to say one that has a good relationship with the cyber teams. Yet to find it, but important you choose that team well.
And IT and OT generally, I mean, don't get along. I think I went to the Cyber Senate last year, and their thing was, why can't we just get along?
Yeah.
And it's more kind of down to the fact that IT has been doing cybersecurity for so long that is kind of their world, and they understand that. And I think the difficulty now is, like with things like secure remote access, with trying to get data out of this environment, we've now introduced a new risk that people weren't really aware of, and it's a completely different ball game. So you can't take all of the tools that we've been developing for years on the IT side and just throw them across the fence onto the OT side. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that. And therefore, you've got a kind of miscommunication between two teams. So therefore, when you're trying to bring them back together for things like incident response, etc., it can be slightly difficult. I think once you start to get the understanding of this bit is mine, this bit is yours, this bit is the shared kind of piece that we both need to look after, that's when you start to move it forward. But it's not easy. It's every organization that I think I've been in, it's been the same.
You mentioned before we joined just in the backstage that you always get your Tom in place first, and I think that's really important. Whether it's just an interim Tom to get you moving and then you iterate it and grow it, I think that's absolutely key. You need to know where your boundaries are. If you own it or you just provide it, you're responsible for providing services into it. You've got to sort that out immediately, otherwise it just becomes as you say, you start saying to the IT and OT team, just do me a favor, put your weapons down, please. Just let's talk for a minute.
Yeah, we did the big divide as well of who owns what. I think the difficulty sometimes is it becomes very difficult if it's an OT system within the IT environment and the OT team wants to own it, the IT team looks after it. And then you get into those weird conversations of I own it, but you manage it. So you the service provider, or how is this relationship now going to work? But yeah, the target operating model is key because it should tell people what they should be doing, and how much increase in workload it is as well. So one thing that, even incident response will have a workload increase to a certain person's role. If they don't have that time or capability or capacity, then in the event of an incident, they won't be there to be able to do it. So again, it's trying to set those out clearly.
So we've got a question from Connor just come through, Connor Seymour, who was one of our previous guest panelists, and thanks, Connor, for rejoining. With the method most of us in OT security gain employment, contracting, there's also a need to make sure that the business permanent staff have the ability to use and respond when an incident response plan is activated. One thing Connor struggles with is putting across the type of people to employ to fill those gaps. What have been your struggles in making businesses understand this?
I've tried to do it at the start. So the one thing is, if you try and do this right at the end, so you do all of your plans and everything else, and as a contractor, you then kind of skip off into the sunset, is try and do it up front. So ensuring that people understand what their roles and responsibilities are. I spoke to the EC&I group engineer yesterday, and we were talking through kind of incident response. And what I'm trying to do is impart a load of knowledge into him as to what he would need to do in the case of an incident. Now it's going to be a kind of slow build, but I'm planning to do that kind of more education over a period of time. And then as well, it's the handover. You can't forget about the handover. Like, I think every organization that I've been in, my handover normally consists of about kind of 14 pages each to individuals as to what their role is that I'm now leaving behind. Or in certain instances like this one, potentially somebody might replace me as a virtual CISO to do that role. And again, there'll be a complete handover to those. But it's doing it at the start for me is always kind of critical, getting people aligned to it, because otherwise you get the plan. Nobody wants to do it at the end.
Is there work to be done with job profiles within the business as well, so that they've got a sort of a template of competencies and skills that are needed in certain roles to be able to take forward? Because as Connor does, he contracts, he goes, from one organization to the next as a consultant and helping, but once he leaves, that knowledge is gone. So is that a way to help to repeat that process of, or I guess repeat that behavior that's needed?
I think it goes back to the point before. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I created a really nice spreadsheet that says what the individual needs to do kind of for the deployment, and then what the individual needs to be able to do post the deployment of something. So, and that's normally the scary bit where you go, it's going to take you an extra 2 hours per week to look after this system and actually to monitor it, manage it, etc. And that's normally where you then get into the conversations of, does that individual have the capacity to do so? And if they don't, then you need to start to look at, do you therefore need to recruit somebody to be able to do that? And if the individual doesn't understand some of the different areas, then they either need to be trained or you need to recruit again. So yeah, for me, it's so integral.
You also have I would say it's an issue of people saying, not my problem. And then it's like trying to identify who the owner is, and the owner says, well, and they have the infighting of who actually owns it. Once you've identified who actually owns it, is do they have a skill set? No. Okay. Do we need to find a contractor? Do we need to upskill someone? How are we going to go about doing that? It's going back, as you're mentioning, Rob, and Sam, people, process, technology. Yeah, the technology is deployed, but who are the people who are running the technology? So yeah, that's always the merry-go-round that I find myself stuck in.
And I think, going back to what I said earlier about making sure each site embeds it, and one site passes that knowledge to another and they go and help them do it, and then you build up a network of people who respond. Because when you need people to go into an organization and do hands-on work on control systems during an incident, generally you would like it to be a contracted third party, if they still exist, or someone in your own organization. So if you can then call other sites and say, listen, we've got that incident, we've all planned for this, it's our site, not yours, but can you come over and help? I think that's really important, because my experience of incidents, whether it's IT or OT, you've got to stand up big quick, then you can scale it down. But there are only certain people who can get hands-on on some of that equipment, because there's kind of all risk and insurance issues, etc. So getting your own people skilled up and getting that knowledge spread and embed within your organization is important.
I think possibly as a last kind of follow-up question on Connor's point is, and this is something that gets asked quite a lot when I'm speaking to people in OT world. What training partners or what training bodies are really focusing on OT security and can to help enable the right behaviors and building people up? Because I think there's a transition of filling the gap of OT security skilled people in the market. So is there anything that's available to help with that and to build really competent, industry recognized trained personnel?
Yes.
I think they're starting to. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the ISA do some. So they've got their OT cybersecurity expert, which looks at IEC 62443. And then there's just individual companies. We're currently looking at Thales because they provide some practical testing. So actually, you can go to a site and you can test out what an incident would look like, which is interesting. Sorry, Max.
I would say, and if you're looking on an individual certification type route as well, SANS have their ICS division, and to be honest, they give a lot of free advice in terms of the ICS environments as well. So that's always quite a good place to start, as well as your big technology vendors, your Clarities, your Dragoses of the world. There's lots of information that they give out that can help upskill if you've got your workforce.
Good stuff. Right, we've got another question from Suresh, and it's in OT cybersecurity. From an OT cybersecurity auditor point of view, how can one evaluate the effectiveness of incident response?
Starts with the data, I would say. I mean, in terms of, you can only audit what you can see, and you can only audit if, this is always the catch-22 with a lot of OT equipment is getting good data out and having the right data. So yeah, I'd say that's your starting point. I don't know if anyone wants to add on to that.
Yeah, you could just try out an incident. Just do one.
Cause one.
Yeah. Sorry, Rob.
No, I think you raise a good point. That the only way to really this is actually have the incident. But I struggle with audit in the OT space because red, amber, green doesn't tell you anything. Red might be absolutely fine, to be honest, and the business is willing to accept that, and it's something you don't need to change. So it's a challenging environment to do audit on. But I think you've got to get involved in that testing piece. You've got to be involved in that testing of the response, testing of the plan, and see it for yourself. Is what they're saying real? Is it immersive? Are they just reading through a document and nodding at each other, or actually they sat there thinking, well, actually, we don't have a backup system. We don't have a contract with that vendor. In fact, the vendor for that system's gone 25 years ago. Actually, we don't know how we would do that. And really starting to, you can see what happens. People start to unpick themselves. And this is why response recovery exercise is superb for people sitting there and just watching it unravel in your head. If you hit there to say, oh, I'm here to do cybersecurity, you just complete switch off. But actually, when you get in that response recovery and they start thinking, actually, we don't have a spare of that, and you can just see things unravel in their head, and they go, gosh, yeah, you're right. Actually, we're pretty vulnerable in this place, and we need to go away and do something about that. And it's not just from a cyber perspective; it's actually from just a general site maintenance and availability. So doing this exercise well actually helps all the other activities of running a plant.
I would say I would also be cautious as well with the sort of red, amber, green. If it's OT environment, if it's a vulnerability on a certain piece of equipment, yes, you could update it. But the problem with an OT environment, that may have a knock-on effect of your production. So if you've got one particular vulnerability, it may not be physically possible unless you have to replace a whole line, and you can quite easily get into the tens of millions of pounds depending on the business just to fix one machine because it's not compatible with the rest of it. So I would be very careful when you're presenting risk to say, okay, yeah, it's red for this reason, because I think there's actually more mechanisms in this, I guess, where your network defense comes in. You can actually start to block and isolate that piece of equipment. You may not be able to upgrade it, but you can do other measures.
Can I just make a short statement on the back of that? I'm constantly saying not all cyber risk equals business risk, which I think is exactly the same as what you're saying. Yes, it's a cyber risk. Is it a risk that we want to take to our business? No, let's just it's red, and that's great.
And that comes down to kind of operational resilience. And you look at a piece of equipment and it might be failing, and that's the one that you're going to replace because it's failing. The one next to it, which has got a kind of red vulnerability, but nobody can actually get to it, you're not going to invest your money there. So it is looking at that rounded business risk. And some organizations are very good at that, of being able to kind of articulate, you've got a cyber risk against this as well as it's going to fail. The other thing that's always petrifying is when you start to speak to the engineers and you go, so what would you do to replace this? They go, eBay. Just go on eBay, buy it there, hope for the best.
That is so true. I was in Australia some years back and I was talking about why they were upgrading it, because they were it was finding it harder and harder to buy parts for this critical furnace control system on eBay. Hence the costly upgrade.
Because that's the thing, isn't it? The life cycle of these equipment, companies go out of business, whoever made it, 25 years ago or whatever it may be, and then everyone's fighting for the parts that are left in the market. So yeah, it's a bit of a unique challenge with OT, that one.
Would you recommend setting up an eBay account, or is it kind of a bit?
They automate them, so they
Oh,
will
right.
set a price banding and they will automate buying certain kind of things. It's incredible. Well, they're engineers, so of course they do.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Right.
that bit is then terrifying when you just say, well, what have you tested it? That's the other thing. Do you know that these parts that you bought, have you ever tested? No, we've never tested them because we don't want the downtime.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're hoping on these 5 devices that we bought from eBay that they're going to work because they said they worked within the description. Good.
They check the eBay seller's reviews,
Yeah.
haven't they, obviously? So yeah.
Yeah, it was 4.5 stars. We think it should be fine.
It's okay. Good stuff. All right. Well, let's move in. We've got just over 10 minutes left. So let's move into a couple of the post-incident sort of questions. When we look at an incident and the recovery and restoration process, typically how are we approaching that? So the incident's happened. What's the process for recovery and restoration in OT?
Well, you've got to follow the plan. Are we talking with or without plan here? Because without
either. Whoever shouts loudest.
Yeah.
Again, it's got to be safety first. How it depends how the plant shut down, because some plants that if it's had a very fast shutdown won't restart for some time, and that also is another risk. Giant furnaces, they take months and months to be able to shut down properly. But if you've got to kill systems to shut that down quick, then there might actually be other costs associated with it. But it's having that minimum viable company back in your head. What is it I need to get producing again? How do I do this safely? How can I be sure about my environment? So there's a few factors to go out there. But I think you've got to make that. In IT, it's very easy to say, right, I'm just building a whole new green environment over here after my incident. You don't really have that luxury in there. So you're going to have to take a punt and say, right, I think it's contained. I'm not sure. But you're going to have to get some monitoring in place, and you can do that. Temporary monitoring. If you've not got it in place, get temporary monitoring in place. So as you start to bring systems back online, and there will be a sequence that operations know about for bringing those systems back online, regardless of whether it's cyber or not. So you've got to be following those operational sequences that keep you safe, and you must follow that. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself into quite a situation.
And it's situational as well. So, and time of year. So different times of year might affect different businesses in a certain way. So, for example, over Christmas, you may take in less waste. So therefore, all of a sudden, the intake of waste might be more important during that particular time of year, rather than the rest of the time of year where the waste is actually, you can build it up within the bunker, and therefore you've got a fuel source, and that's fine. So it's having that in the back of your mind as well. Is this process always the same? Or does it kind of alter over a time of year? Good example on the IT side is obviously when you've got end of year accounts where you need to be paying people. That's the worst time to obviously have a cyber attack, but you need to be able to know that if payroll system was hit at the start of the month, it's less of a worry than if it's at payday.
Okay, so what about a backup and recovery strategy? What's the how do we back up for incidents, and how do we plan that out, and what does that look like?
Make sure you have one and tested thoroughly. If you want it as a sentence, I think I've seen a lot of organizations in previous jobs. They've got them, they take them. Do they test them? There's very few people that actively test the backups on a regular basis. That really is critical. And
you need a baseline backup as well, one that that you can go to, that hasn't been taken recently, that is super clean. So creating those baseline ones, recreating those baseline backups, and getting into a regime where they are, I would say, kind of offline, inverted commas. is important, whether it's off-site, whether it's somebody comes in, whether in a fireproof safe, whatever it is. And yes, there are systems these days that claim to be able to do that, but they've got to be well away from the system, virtually or physically.
So I think there's a lot of similarities, obviously, with IT and OT in that regard. But I think the main piece with OT is we're talking sort of ladder logic and PLC programs and things like that. That can get complicated very quickly. Unfortunately, it can, and testing that as well, you can't always test it, and you suffer all the problems that we've previously mentioned. So I think as well, it's really understanding what you should be backing up and what you need, because it's very easy to go, well, I backed up this system, but the system could have 3 PLCs and you're just backed up one of them. So to actually understand exactly what you should be backing up and understanding the process of that, because I have seen it before previously that they are backed up one PLC and not the other 3, and that didn't go too well. So, and this was in a test, luckily. So having that clear understanding is critical.
And I just ask, is it still the case, because it was when I was hands-on control engineer, that when you restore that PLC code or that controller code, because I used to work a lot on the Eurotherm type systems, that it would restore it with the previous parameters. So you would then get a parameter change in your process, and then you have to go through and manually quickly change all the set points, outputs, that kind of thing, to make sure that you drop back into a safe mode.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I've seen it before, especially depending on how sensitive the system is. Obviously, being from a food manufacturer, temperature is really, really sensitive from all the production line. So having these sort of parameters checked and make sure everyone understands what it should be at, and like you say, the time of year, all of these factors, you're just kind of layering complication on complication, but they are all things in an incident response strategy that needs to be thought through.
Yeah, it's not like the IT space where we'll go, okay, we'll try and manually put all the data later. You dump that controller back on and it's controlling something, but not what you thought it was. And that's pretty risky.
And even something simple like version history. So what version are you on? Because there's nothing better than restoring on a previous version that doesn't work with any of your other equipment.
Yeah.
So it's just taking all of those things into account, and lots of things can be forgotten about, is I think essentially what we're saying. And you need to be really clear what the most important thing is to be able to back up from and to.
Stuff. So final point is disaster recovery planning and business continuity management. How important is this as a function? What are we looking at from?
Okay, so I can give you some, and the analogy will be more from the IT area, but it does apply across. I think BCP and DR are very useful things. If you have an extinction level type event, they're not so useful, because generally they rely on something around it still being alive to be able to pull it back up on, in terms of business continuity or disaster recovery. So yes, useful. However, you need to have the scenario where they may not work, because I say they rely on something being around them to pull them back up.
For me, that is the BCP. So like systems go down, and I don't know about you, but I'm sure that a lot of incident responders have come to something and gone, it's just broken. There's no massive kind of issue apart from it stopped working, maybe because the part from eBay failed. But yeah, that's a bit in my BCP, is if you can define if something's broken, completely broken, what's your manual process that you can do? So for us, it's, if all of a sudden we can't weigh the rubbish and get the ticket through to the supplier that supplied it, what is the manual process that we could do? And can we do that kind of, because we could just weigh it, print out a ticket, and then even possibly text it. But that's where the BCP plans for me are really, really kind of, they're the precursor to this. The incident bit is kind of, I've just now given you a different scenario to a similar problem for me. And then disaster recovery should be, again, it's that testing of how do you do that normally? Mm-hmm. And now we've got an incident, we just have to do this new scenario where we need to contain it as well.
Yeah, I think
and eradicate it.
my challenge is, say you have an incident that wipes out all the Windows boxes in an industrial environment, because you
Yeah.
then BCP becomes a little more challenging, because BCP is more of a
Individual process. It's always looking at individual process and how you kind of get past them. But yeah.
So segment.
Well, I think as well, it applies on the industry quite heavily. So, for example, if we lost a factory producing dough, we would look at what other factories can pick up the slack, and what time of the year, and what's our order numbers, and all that sort of stuff. If you're running a power plant, you've got quite a lot of loss there. So you've also got to tailor it to, what if this scenario happens? What would we do to your business? Or it has to be applied to that business as well, because I think they'll look quite different, the business continuity, depending on which business you're talking about. And equally, we mentioned time of year, time of day, whatever it may be, depending on what cycle you're currently in.
A bit like pizza on when England play football.
Yeah, I wonder when that's happened. Yeah.
Good stuff. Right, this brings us to a close today. Thanks everyone for joining, especially to the panelists today, Michael, Rob, Max, and Sam. Thanks for sharing your experience and your knowledge. Please do feel free to reach out to myself or any of the panelists in future. The community is absolutely about networking and collaboration and learning from each other, so don't be shy. I'll be sharing the recording and shorter clips of today's session on the LinkedIn channel, on YouTube as well. So just the usual quick favor from me is to ask, if you get the chance, like and share any of the videos, because the engagement's going to help to promote the channel and the community to grow. But thanks again for joining. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Take care.
Have a good day. Bye.